Institute rendezvous. And we're going to be talking today about where we're headed, war economics and the crisis, a conversation between Adam Tooze and Nick Mulder. Before I make the introductions, let me just go over some of the housekeeping rules. James is going to make sure that all the people listening in the audience are muted, and also that their videos are off, so that when the conversation is happening, you will just see the two conversationalists and me. And they will each talk and we will chat for about 45-50 minutes. And then there'll be some time for questions. And if you would like to ask a question, perhaps you can just raise your hand in the participant sidebar so that we can see, and I will field the questions. So I think we're very fortunate today to have with us two of the most interesting commentators on the economic fallout of the coronavirus crisis, Adam Tooze and Nick Mulder. I think that it's fair to say that up until about 12 years ago, economic history was dying a slow death in the United States. And there were an awful lot of respectable history departments that felt they could get by without somebody competent in modern economic history. And it took the 2008 financial crisis to wake people up. And having woken up to the fact that there was this thing called capitalism and it had a history, everybody searched around for people who could give some historical perspective on what had been happening, and very few such people existed. We were lucky at Columbia to be able to bring, I think, the outstanding economic historian of his generation, Adam Tooze, who joined us a few years ago and who's now the Catherine and Shelby Cullum Davis Professor of History. And then I think that Adam would agree with me that he and I were extremely fortunate and learned enough when a young grad student called Nicholas Mulder entered the Columbia doctoral program and exited it pretty smartly, I have to say, and is about to take up a position as an assistant professor of modern European history at Cornell University. So what you have today in this conversation are two generations of Renaissance economic history. Economic history understood in a certain way, which is to say not as a branch of quantitative economics, but simply as an essential part of understanding the modern world. So completely bound up with questions of power and politics and international affairs. Let me give you a very brief background on each. Nick Mulder got his BA from University College Utrecht, an MPhil in Cambridge, and then, as I've said, a PhD at Columbia, where his dissertation was on the interwar history of the idea of economic sanctions as a weapon. And so you will understand how you move from that pretty smartly into some understanding of how wars and crises can transform economies, particularly liberal economies, in ways that don't look terribly liberal. This will become a book, The Economic Weapon, and he's also working, at least as relevantly, I think, for today's perspective now, on questions of expropriation, the history of expropriation in the 20th century. So it's a great pleasure to have Nick here with us, who has been writing some extremely thought-provoking pieces in the press, and with him, the Catherine and Shelby Cullum Davis Professor of History at Columbia University, Adam Tooze. Adam took his BA in economics from Cambridge and then a PhD from the LSE. And this probably interests only me at this point, but Adam's supervisor at the LSE, and this illustrates something about the fragility of knowledge, I think, was maybe the outstanding economic historian of the second half of the 20th century in Britain, Alan Milward. So there is a genealogy that goes from Milward to Tooze to Mulder, writing about sanctions. But of course, Alan Milward's supervisor was a man called Norton Medlicott, who was a big figure after the Second World War and who had been working in the Second World War in the Cabinet Historical Office writing what remains until Nick's book comes out, the standard work on economic blockade. So in a curious way, you can see through this intellectual genealogy a return for us to some of the concerns that animated people in the Second World War, and it's not that far away intellectually. I won't say much more about Adam. His works will be familiar to many of you. At least 4 outstanding books, most of which have won important prizes. The ones that will be perhaps familiar with you will be Wages of Destruction, absolutely masterly economic history of the Nazi war economy, The Deluge, about the Great War and the remaking of the global order, and most recently Crashed, which is a history of how financial crises changed the world after 2008. All of these, and especially the last 2, involve a kind of meditation on the changing power relationship between Europe and the United States in the course of the 20th and the early 21st century. And I expect that's something that we will touch on now as well. So I think that's enough from me. The way we're going to play this is that each of our participants will talk 5-10 minutes, as long as they want really, on this subject. And then we will start a conversation. And at the end of the conversation, we'll open up for questions. So I'll hand over now to Nicholas Mulder. Nick, thank you very much.
Yes, well, thank you very much, Mark, for that very generous introduction. And also thanks to James for doing the logistics for this session. It's a real pleasure to be in this panel. So I think the place where I would start with talking about the war economy as an analogy for what we're in right now is not really as a perfect mirror to hold up to the present. It's not, it's an imperfect analogy. We're clearly not in an actual war. But when I wrote a piece about this last month, I think the thing that I was trying to do was to bring out a few features of the economy and of what's going on in the world right now that I think we can learn something from and that were very present in war economies. So the war economy is something that brings to light things that are already latent in economic life. And it can also, I think, illuminate some really useful priorities for policy. So the 5 things that I think are useful, and I'm sure that Adam may want to add others or perhaps dispute some of them, are productivity, sacrifice, reform, solidarity, and inventiveness. Productivity is probably the easiest one to understand, and I think that that's really what about a month and a half ago when the virus hit, a lot of us were thinking about immediately. How do we ramp up the production of things like ventilators? How do we ensure that we have adequate medical equipment, that also the amount of people that we need in trained medical staff are where they need to be. That was a very immediate kind of, I think, reflex. We're now obviously already much further advanced. And so I think that in that sense, my thinking on this has changed as well. Our concern now, it seems to be, is less emergency production and much more thinking about the long-term structural effect of the virus on the world economy. The second one, though, sacrifice, I think is still with us in a certain way, not just because now the United States, where I'm speaking from, has a very, very high death toll as a result of this pandemic, but also I think because what we were seeing and what we are for the last few weeks, certainly, is a very big asymmetry between who has to continue to work and who is able to stay at home. Some people were calling this a demobilizing experience because the lockdown and the quarantine fixed people in place. I think that if we look at specific groups of workers, actually, it is clear that there are quite a few people who have to continue to work in order to keep things running, not just delivery people and those working in vital retail and consumer goods, supermarkets, etc., but also agricultural workers. One of the really striking phenomena in Europe in the last few weeks was to see planes full of workers from Romania and the other Eastern European countries arrive in Germany to pick asparagus. That's certainly something that really starkly illustrates that labor migration even still exists in this pandemic. And of course, I mean, I don't want to make this comparison too much, but one thing that did happen in both World War I and World War II was also, of course, that Germany drew on the population of other countries in order to perform labor. Now, of course, that was under very different conditions and with a much graver kind of ideological goal. But I think it's nonetheless interesting in structural terms to see that Germany continues to be an economy that still also functions on migrant labor, and that was even prioritized under these conditions. Then the third thing, reform. Now, I think that Adam probably has a lot of really interesting things to say about that. A large, I think, amount of attention has now fallen onto central banks as the key actors in this crisis. They've been enormously inventive. They've gone really, really much further still than they did in 2008 when they kind of had to grow into the role, sometimes very belatedly, of crisis managers. Now what we've seen is a really, really proactive, I think, approach by the Federal Reserve in the United States and the Bank of England, but also the ECB, which is now being contested in Germany, right? It has undertaken a really quite a forceful response, and in doing so is far ahead of what European leaders are willing to do still in terms of an economic response to the crisis. Now, the final 2 points I don't want to spend too much time on right now, but I'm very happy to talk about them later, solidarity and inventiveness. As we're trying to, I think, map what the long-term effects of this pandemic are going to be economically, and I think it's really safe to say that very few people know what's in store even up to the end of this year. There might be a return, there might have to be a reimposition of certain control measures. Then, of course, the longer that lockdowns last, the more people are put out of work, the more businesses will go bankrupt. Those are essentially economic resources that when a bankruptcy happens or someone loses their job, they end up being in a state of extreme precarity. And if they're not used again very quickly, people start to drop out of the labor force long term. Certain assets degrade beyond repair. So that is a very big danger that we're running, this output gap that is growing. But there are obviously also developments taking place right now that I think call for discussions about solidarity and fairness. One of the really remarkable things has been to see that there was a very strong financial reaction in March, especially late March, and still a bit in early April as well around the world to the shock of the virus. And since then, in many places, the stock markets have been slowly recovering, even as unemployment figures have been really going up tremendously. What that, I think, also points to is this divergence, of course, between the financial part of the economy and the real economy. And it, I think, raises the question of how we are going to keep income circulating between them, because ultimately, in political terms, both parts of those economy exist in the same nation states. They might have very divergent economic fortunes, but they are still part of specific national communities. And there have been, I think, increasingly interesting proposals for ways to boost investment, but also for imposing taxation on these rising financial fortunes. And one of the really big places where this kind of wealth is accumulating at the moment is in the investment industry. So those companies, the asset managers, now have seen a lot of the assets under their control grow even more as a result of the crisis. So the top 3 asset managers, and I'm sure that many of you will know them by name or maybe have pension investments, BlackRock, Fidelity, and State Street, now control about 61% of the total assets in the asset management industry in just 3 companies. So that's an enormous concentration that's grown, and it's almost doubled since the last crisis. And it seems to me that they are now, in a sense, the kind of cutting edge of the financial sector globally. And we'll have to have much more discussion about what that means also internationally speaking, and what the kind of responsibilities are, what the kind of forms of oversight and control that we have over these firms. I think I'll leave it at that for now and turn to Adam. But thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Nick. Thank you, Adam. We'll turn over to you.
Well, thank you, Mark. Thank you, Nick. Thank you to the Institute for organising this event. It's a pleasure to be part of it. I'll be relatively brief in this first round because I want to get into a conversation with Mark and Nick as quickly as possible, and I've not really had the chance to talk to them as much as I would have liked over the last couple of months. So, and I've heard myself talking about the economic impact of this crisis rather too much for my own comfort. I have to say I was initially skeptical about the framing of the crisis in terms of the history of wars and the experience of wars, and I remain so. But I think the way Nick has done it just now and the way that he did it in his piece is the way to do it if you're going to pursue it. So you, as it were, distill out a series of key lines of experience, of political thinking that are associated with the war and the experience of the war. And you ask, as it were, how might those help us to illuminate our current situation now? And I think his grid is interesting. The juxtaposition of sacrifice and productivity, I think, is really profoundly interesting and thought-provoking. The association of reform with the wars is interesting, as is solidarity. And then his stress, and he didn't really get enough time to talk about this, but I really recommend his piece in Foreign Policy, in which he focuses in on inventiveness, because there's something about the nature of a crisis like this that demands a scrambling response, a response which isn't necessarily premeditated, that relies on resources of improvisation fundamentally, and creativity. And one shouldn't underestimate, I think, this sort of crisis in that respect. There's a tendency, and I think and I'll come on to this in just a second, the way in which the war analogy was mobilized in late March, when it was really being used most, that is this year, was with regard to planning, fundamentally. It was with regard to a sort of coercive top-down state response, which would demand, you know, the allocation of resources to the rapid production of personal protective equipment, or the commandeering of factories to make respirators. Whereas what I think Nick teases out very brilliantly is that planned element needs to be seen in a kind of dialectical relationship with more improvised moves. I wanted not to use the word improvise because it seems to me that improvisation is precisely the dialectic between the premeditated, the rehearsed, the practiced, and the spontaneous, the radical, the immediately given response. And I think that's really a key term for thinking about the nature of this emergency, because it's after all true, and it's become more and more clear, that all of the leading countries affected, in fact, had plans. China, the United States, Britain, all had plans to counter a crisis like this, and had huge difficulty in actually bringing to bear at the crucial moment. It's like a jazz saxophonist who spent months and months and months rehearsing scales, and at the crucial moment is actually unable to deliver the riff and the creative curl around, you know, whatever's going on in the bass line, despite having had this huge backlog. But I want actually to step back a little bit further, and my allergic response, I think, to the invocation of the war economy has a lot to do with my bicultural upbringing between Britain and Germany in the 1970s, which has given me a permanent allergy to the tendency of the Anglophone world to reach for the war as a positive source of inspiration for thinking about problems of the present. Because it's not obvious why you would do that. After all, the war was a bloody event. It had the shape that it did largely as the result of catastrophe early on in the war on the part of the Western powers. It cost the lives of tens of millions of people. What does it tell us about the way in which our politics and our culture are wired, that it is so compelling to go there, and especially in Britain, but also to a degree in the United States, looking further afield, also in China. So the Chinese regime declared this a people's war very early on. And especially the second wave of lockdown in the wider province of Hubei, in the cities other than Wuhan, was explicitly under, I gather, the mandate of, as it were, a state of siege, military, essentially a state of war was declared, which allowed the population to be essentially enclosed in their apartment buildings, so that they weren't allowed out. So there was and I think we need to, think, and it's fairly obvious as soon as you open this theme, why we would go there. It's the lingering legacy of various types of national memory of World War II, which both in the British and the American case, and in the case of China, can be coded as essentially national struggles, heroic battles won against evil enemies, which are then overcome. And in various ways, with very different effects, that memory is kept alive precisely as a way of designating that moment of energy, that moment of capability, that willingness to mobilize, to sacrifice. That's, as it were, the precondition for that grid of possible references that Nick has laid out for us so nicely. It just doesn't work, I don't think, in Germany. I mean, that is not the place that anyone will go. You can still make Nick's list, broadly speaking, of productivity, of solidarity, of innovation, of sacrifice, but it isn't anchored in a reference to the war for very obvious reasons. And that makes me begin to wonder about how solid this anchoring is. I mean, part, I think, of those of us who are serious and thinking about Nick's brilliant dissertation on the blockade, those of us who I think have, in a sense, and I see Carol Gluck's on this call as well, great friend of the Institute. And for those of us who spend our lives thinking about the history of the war, what is it that doing that, what purpose does it serve? And I've always felt very leery of allowing it to, as it were, be used as a to-do list, because what I want to emphasize is the nature of the violence, the nature of the destruction. That's what really sets that apart. And it's radical. I mean, if you're writing the history of Japan, if you're writing the history of Nazi Germany, if you're writing the history of the Soviet Union, that's what makes that radioactive, in a sense problematic. If you want to reference that as a source of how we're going to deal with ventilator supplies in 2020, it seems to me the politics of that need establishing, explaining, and structuring. And contraceptively, prophylactically, I would urge against using that route. And I have a knee-jerk sort of suspicion of the politics that does reach to a moment of such violence. Of course, in the crisis itself, the fact that COVID-19 confronts us not just with a regular problem of governance, but literally with a problem of life and death, there is an analogy that's a little bit too close for comfort. This isn't your regular sort of economic problem. This is literally about whether your grandparents or your dear senior colleagues or anyone else who's vulnerable can survive. And that gives the entire discussion an edge. I thought when Nick Ray talked about sacrifice, he might actually be going there, because America right now is engaged in an extraordinary, deliberate sacrifice of at least the life chances of a considerable percentage of its population so as to restart the economy. A really quite deliberate calculus of life and death pertaining directly to the question of whether you restart the economy. I'm also suspicious of the way in which war figures. What about war is it that we draw out? What could we make? What aspects of the experience of war are relevant? And I think, again, there's a sort of a really fascinating and productive tension in Nick's list and in this matrix that he offers for us, which is really fertile. On the one hand, there is the sense, and it goes back to what I started by saying, what the war offers us is a sort of image of planning, of control, of top-down leverage. But that's one sort of war. And the war, after all, that we're remembering now in May every year, and this is the 80th anniversary, is a very different type of war, which is not the war of attrition and World War I and the trenches. It's the war of the blitzkrieg. It's the war of the sudden overturning of all existing and apparently solidly anchored structures of power in Europe by the extraordinary aggression, the fast-paced movement of the German military in May 1940. Literally in these days is what we're talking about. In the space of 10 days, 2 weeks, the German army overthrew France and fundamentally changed the balance of power and ushered, as David Reynolds would say, the beginning of the 20th century was really in this May of 80 years ago. That's another way of thinking about war. As a challenge which is not that of planning, not that of attrition, not that of the trenches, but of the instant threat, which, if we fail to react to it quickly enough, will overwhelm us and change the world forever. And that too, after all, is inside the image of war, and is something that I think, if we were going to use the war as a matrix for thinking, it seems to me that that lesson is as significant as any other that we might draw. And it brings me to my concluding comment, which is that struggling to find a better frame within which to situate this than the one which I grew up in and which I fear we are constantly drawn back to if you come from a certain background, which is that mid-century crisis. What should we locate this shock in? And you could locate it against the background, as Mark did, of 2008. You could locate it against the background, I think, of the geopolitical tensions that were preoccupying us so much, the China-America question. But the one in the end, which I find most compelling, is to locate it against the background of the Anthropocene. But the Anthropocene, not as it were, we understood it, through the climate change problem, which I would suggest is the Anthropocene of the trenches. It's the Anthropocene of structural war. It's the Anthropocene of energy mobilization, which then has an answer which is on an attritional timescale. Greta Thunberg gives us 12 years. That's an attritional kind of timescale. What I think COVID-19 confronts us with is another face of the Anthropocene, which is the blitzkrieg face of the Anthropocene, if you like. It's the Anthropocene that will overwhelm you not in 12 years, but in 12 days. And it's girding ourselves and understanding how we respond to that kind of crisis, which then, as Nick was laying out, produces second order and third order effects as we fail to control the epidemic on the day-to-day basis. That then forces a lockdown, and that then sends a shockwave, an anticipatory shockwave through the global financial markets in May. That is an aspect which I think we have to get to grips with, and it will require a coordination of governmental capacity which is structured in logics which are potentially extremely uncomfortable and are those of precautionary preparation, are those of preparation of a defensive variety, which does indeed put an absolute premium on the last point of Nick's list. In other words, our ability to improvise, our ability to counterattack, our ability to respond on an hourly and daily basis, rather than our ability to prepare over the long horizon.
Thank you, Abdom. Well, perhaps I can just sort of respond in a way and I'll ask you both some things that seem to flow from what you've just said. I mean, if we start with the Anthropocene, so I've got three areas in which I want to ask questions, but if we start with the Anthropocene, then what I would like is to understand what's different now from the 14th century, from the Black Death, or what's different from the Great Cholera pandemics of the 19th century. Were they living in the Anthropocene as well, or is there something qualitatively different? But it seemed to me that your prescription, Adam, for what we need to do is governmental coordination, and that takes us into a second area of things, which is that there have been two responses internationally to this: greater coordination amongst some countries and greater unilateralism amongst others, of which the United States is the obvious example. So there would be a second set of issues that I'd be interested in your responses to, about whether this crisis, in the way of other great crises, is going to usher in some fundamental transformation in the international balance of power between the US and Europe and China at this point. But let me come back finally to the war economy, because it seems to me that it's not a bad framing to have in mind if one wants to get at what's different this time round, and what the challenges are this time round. And you know, the reason for the nostalgia that you perhaps, or certainly I feel about a certain image of 1940s, early 1940s state mobilization in the British experience, and I think in the American experience, was the war was transformative in the role of the state. Maybe not quite true in quite the same way in Germany. And it had very powerful after effects in framing a new kind of managed capitalism for 20 or 30 years after that. And if I think about that war economy and where we are now, I see some radical differences. So that one major difference is who is responsible for putting out the fire. And the politicians have really taken a back seat, as Nick said here, to two forces, or to 1.5 forces. One of the central bankers, which is completely consistent with what had been happening in politics in the last 20 years. And the other, arguably, is the financial sector in general and the investment and asset managers in particular. So that puts us in a completely new situation. On the one hand, the state is rapidly accumulating huge liabilities. And yet this is being managed by a political class that doesn't really believe that's what they should be doing. That seems to me a big change. And there's a second change, which is that there was no dispute that in the early 1940s that the state had the right to do this. There was no significant place from which to challenge the state. But of course now, and you see that most clearly in the Trump administration, the administration itself is challenging itself. Mm-hmm. And it's espousing a business position, or a position of opening up. And one of the results is that it gives power in this crisis to a third sector that we haven't talked about. That's the judiciary. The judiciary are becoming arbiters of what is permitted and what is not permitted. Whether you're talking about the German Constitutional Court, or whether we're going to end up having litigation in the event that governments attempt to expropriate funds from asset managers. Mm-hmm. You can see from the experience of the Argentine foreign debt and others where this is going to end up. It's going to end up in the New York courts. Mm-hmm. So the war analogy seems to be helpful precisely because it suggests that we're in a very different place and we have very different capabilities if we want to coordinate a response. So just throwing these points back at both of you, Nick and Adam, for your responses.
Yes, so I'll start with your last point, Mark, about the transformation in the role of the state, which I think is a very acute one. And the best outcome, it seems to me, that this might have is that precisely as you said, because of the power of finance and of central banks, and also just the importance that financial flows have to the world economy today, that will end up in a new kind of policy framework where effectively politicians learn simply by observing what's going on in front of them that things such as debt are not necessarily a problem in the short term when you solve a crisis. And this is really a kind of almost kind of a conditioning that it just needs to be seen to be believed, that the financial sector in fact has no problem with debt, issues a lot of it, makes great money off of it, that this is very normal to the way that the economy already works, but that we in the last 40 years have actually told large parts of our populations and voters that debt is the kind of kiss of death that is really toxic to democracy and that you should avoid it like, I don't want to say like the plague in this case, but that you should avoid it at all costs. And so the best outcome, it seems to me, taking your point there, would be to end up somewhere close to what, I guess a good name for it coming out of World War II for this framework, it was never really taken up, but it is still sometimes used, is functional finance. That essentially it was really developed by Abba Lerner, who was a kind of radical left Keynesian economists working for the US government in the 1930s and 40s. And he made this point that essentially you just have to throw everything but the kitchen and the kitchen sink at this problem, and you need to spend money only with an eye to what its effects are in the world. And if the problem is not solved in the world, you haven't spent enough, and you need to basically keep doing it. And so in that sense, it's functional. It's looking purely at effects. It's not looking at rules such as, what is the proportion of debt to GDP or what's the size of our budget deficit. It's all based on a functional approach. And arguably the only country that really has any experience doing that in the last decade, two and a half decades or so, is Japan. They had this kind of crisis that fundamentally, they had a crisis at the very end of the 80s, early 90s, and it really kind of lowered their growth path. And since then, they have essentially been pioneering all of the policies that Western policymakers also grasped for after the 2008 crisis: quantitative easing, intervening directly in the stock market, going negative interest rates, which is something that's now again a discussion about whether the Fed will do it or not. And it's interesting that the thing that at the time in the 90s the West reached for when it looked at the rest of the world was the idea of a lost decade. And so if there's something that I think if we step back we can really learn from this moment, what I hope at least, is that it'll also have a kind of effect on the terms that we use to actually understand what's going on in the world economy and where it might go, the kind of philosophy of history that's baked in to our analytical terms. And that's why I really like Adam's suggestion also about thinking about COVID-19 against the backdrop of the Anthropocene. It seems to me that if the structural opportunities for growth will fall as much as a result of this virus as it seems now that they will, simply because if people are out of a job and a lot of businesses go bankrupt and have to be kept on life support, it will really, really put a big wedge between where we could develop and what is actually happening in the economy. It seems that if that is true, then the world as a whole will suffer the kind of lost decade, at which point it no longer makes sense to think about anything being lost. It's just the new normal. So I think that sort of terminology of growth as a normal condition against which we can then measure how well certain regions are doing, this in that sense might be a very humbling experience. And so I think that we might think of it in that way. And then if I could just very quickly add on one more thing about your point about the international balance of power, there too, I think there's a term that's been thrown around a lot recently, which is deglobalization. And one of the big misconceptions that is, I think, baked into that term is that we will see a kind of enormous fragmentation and that somehow all international links and international cooperation will break down. And the point about the financial industry being very much alive and kicking and indeed developing in new ways out of this crisis is that a lot of those links are not going to be severed. That what we're seeing is a kind of rearrangement of globalization, not an end to it or even a reversal. We're seeing a trade at the moment falling, but in other ways, very much new international kind of entanglements and engagements emerging. The sovereign debt crisis in the global south that seems about to happen, is already happening, is a good example of that. But so. Thank you, Nick. Adam.
Well, I agree with so much of what Nick started by saying. That I'll just focus squarely on the first question that you put, Mark, about what is historically novel, if anything, about this moment, which is the classic historian's question, if I may say so, and one which I maybe because of my only rather incomplete upbringing as a historian, consistently try to avoid and reject. So let me try and make the case for radical novelty. I mean, no one, of course, would claim that there haven't been large-scale pandemic diseases before in history. And one way of neutralizing the objection will be to say, and their ability to spread across the Silk Road and then around the early phases of early 19th century globalization is part of modern history. And clearly cholera in particular is reflected upon by the biomedical establishment of the 19th century, very much in terms which are highly reminiscent of today, the first sanitary conferences, were precisely addressing our question. In other words, how do we contain the spread of plague, cholera, and yellow fever with minimum interference to liberal free trade visions? That was the project, really, of the 1850s international sanitary conferences, to proof international trade against arbitrary invocations of medical panic on the part of self-interested customs officials on the one hand, and on the other hand, how do we contain the spread of infectious diseases from Asia to the West? These are the two overriding preoccupations. This is not, to that extent, new. The Wuhan virus diagnosis is already there. All the way down to the 1950s, the first UN convention on international health includes giant sub-chapters on how to manage the specific risks of one particular event, which is the Hajj. It's the only specific event treated by the document, and it is an expression of the profound anxiety of Western health officials about the global health effects of Muslims traveling in large numbers to Mecca. So this isn't new by itself, right? And I would obviously admit, as everyone else involved in the Anthropocene discussion does, that in or around the 1820s or 1830s, we see the beginning rise. That's the moment where the steam engine begins to become a real driver of mobility around the entire world, and not just in occasional factories in Britain. What then is, as it were, specific and radical about our current moment? Well, first, I think, is that you're making a wager on what's called the emerging infectious diseases paradigm. In other words, in the same way as there is climate science, which tells us that you reach certain critical tipping points, and there are massive macro sociological and economic drivers, which you can trace back to the 18th century, of course you can, but will acquire critical mass as the global population heads towards 8 billion. More than half the world's population is living in some sort of urban environment, and the agro-industrial complex reaches critical mass, and the last reservoirs of wildlife are subject to absolutely massive pressure. Since the 1970s, epidemiologists of an ecological bent have been telling us, in a way extremely analogous to the climate scientists, that this is a recipe for accumulating disaster. We should from here on in expect a more and more rapid rate of mutation. The Royal Society has done very good work on this, confirming this as best we can. The problem is, of course, as we know now, can you actually test what sorts of mutations have gone on? To the best of our ability, it looks like we're on an ascending curve. And that's what makes this one. And so there's been a whole series of near misses going back to the 1976 swine flu fear, which caused the first national effort in the United States to immunize the entire population against flu. It was a bust. The swine flu didn't show up. 2009 was a similar moment. This COVID-19 is the first one that actually ticked all the boxes and had the effect that this group of scientists have been predicting. So that's the strong analogy to climate science. This is a claim that there's something new under the sun, and it's an effect of quantity shifting into quality. And we are, whether we like it or not, leaving history behind. This is new and radical because we're deep in. The second, even more obvious, I think, real qualitative break is revealed if you think about the response to the influenza pandemic of 1918, 1919. Now, we all know now that killed tens of millions of people. And there is a cottage industry of historians desperately trying to demonstrate to us that even at the time, it was the driver of most of what happened in the 1920s. And it's just not convincing or plausible. There is a radical difference between the way in which the world responded in 1918, 1919, and the way it started to respond from 1976, and the way it responded in 2009, and massively the way it's responded at this moment, which is that, and this is, as it were, you compound Anthropocene by the sorts of conceptual frameworks offered by a Ulrich Beck. Or to go back to Hegel, this isn't just the Anthropocene in itself, this is the Anthropocene for itself. We see this crisis coming. We know how to react to it, and we collectively do. After all, you know, in President Macron's phrase about an anthropological experience is one of his phrases, but it's actually one of his better phrases, right? That it is true that first China and then bookending that India shut down should be regarded as a qualitative break in our collective history. because that's precisely, of course, what the British in colonial administration in 1918, 1919 didn't do. Indian lives were too cheap to count. We don't know even now how many people died. There was no collective imperial response to that epidemic. And as shambolic as our efforts have been this time round, they have been dramatic. The ILO figures that 81% of the global workforce, which wasn't even a category I can tell you that most economic commentators operate in, but we now do. The ILO documented that 81% of the global workforce was under some kind of lockdown regime. That is the most general restriction of productive activity the world has ever seen. And it's deliberate. Mediated by national governments for sure, but generally speaking by a collective awareness of this threat and a sense that every self-respecting government in the world has to respond, and the ones that don't mark themselves as eccentric and pariahs in so doing. And so it's obvious that Modi has to respond in the same way as Nigeria has to respond, South Africa has to respond, and so on and so forth. So that would be for me what, this is the Anthropocene, not just in itself, but for itself. This is a self-conscious realization on our part. And this is also, of course, the particular perspective of an economic historian rather than of a historian of epidemics, because there have been epidemics before, but there's never been a lockdown like this before. And that's what, as Nick was saying, the shock is at the third level. The economic shock is second level. The financial shock is third level. That's radically new, and that is the model with which we were trying to grasp the likely impact of the climate crisis on the financial system, literally in the weeks before this happened to us, on a time scale of days, not years. That's exactly how the central banking community, for instance, was beginning to think about financial risk. What they were talking about were climate Minsky moments, which are moments where, if you like, it's a Wile E. Coyote moment, where you realize you're off the cliff and your wheels are spinning and there's nothing holding you up except the spinning of your wheels. But what delivers the shock in the climate models was also government policy. It wasn't that, Bangladesh would be flooded and therefore the global financial system would fail, because the global financial system doesn't register Bangladesh. But if the Bangladesh crisis triggers a political response in the West, that does register in the global financial system. And that's what the people like Mark Carney at the Bank of England were worried about. And what we've been blindsided by is that hit us not on Greta's timescale, but on the timescale of the Blitzkrieg, of the day-to-day that we now are in. And so on those grounds, I would argue for the radical distinctiveness. It isn't the epidemic per se, it's well, it may be the epidemic and it may be the one, but it's only science that tells us that. And the fact that we inhabit that loop in a radical way that we currently do is what marks this as the first idea of many.
No, it is distinct. I take the point. It is distinctive, and not least because whilst the economic fallout is going to be immeasurably greater than in 1918-19, the global death toll is almost certainly going to be far smaller, which is interesting. I'm going to open this up to questions, and while people are thinking, let me just throw out one last observation at you two. And if anybody does have a question, please just raise your hand on the participant bar. And that is that, Nick, if you're right that this is going to need a reassessment of our attitude to debt and should lead to us realizing debt isn't such a terrible thing, then there's going to be a massive asymmetry globally in which areas are capable of doing this and which are not. Because it seems to me that the US, for instance, as we see, takes an extremely pragmatic attitude to debt. The political argument is all about who should benefit from the new loan programs and packages that are being debated in Congress. There's no debate that they need to do something, and they will do something, and they can do something. There's no hesitation. Similarly, it seems to be for completely different reasons. The same could be said about the Chinese government. The Chinese government has very little opposition. It will do whatever is necessary at this point to keep itself in power. But there's a huge question mark hanging over the European Union.
Yeah.
Because
the emerging markets, Mark. I mean, even more grave. The European Union
for different reasons. For different reasons. Emerging markets because they have no margin, and the European Union because it's locked itself into a box and thrown away the key.
Yeah.
And so we're going to start to see, unless you're right and people really do rethink, huge differences in the way these different areas of the world are able to use debt and respond.
Absolutely, yeah. And the only thing that I'll just say in terms of another historical analogy that is actually quite interesting for thinking about the room for maneuver globally. Actually, well, it's not an analogy, it's more of just a kind of way of thinking about what we're facing right now. In the early 20th century, when you had the gold standard, it was quite clear what you had to do in order to regain a kind of freedom of maneuver. So the gold standard pegged countries' currencies to each other. It meant that they had to essentially follow economic policies that oftentimes went against their own interests. It was, however, quite clear that if you went off the gold standard and you devalued your currency, you didn't just acquire the ability to grow. Oftentimes, what that also allowed you to do is to default on your external debt. And then by growing back, sort of claw back some of the room for negotiation. And I think what's worrying right now about the emerging markets crisis, we no longer live in a gold standard world, right? Exchange rates and currencies are floating freely. However, it still seems like they have really suffered, a lot of developing countries, an enormous shrinking of their room for maneuver. And as what you were talking about with these cases, such as Argentina going to the New York courts, there's now a whole series of new emerging market debt issues where it seems that a lot of investors are following that precedent. So they're going to try and really squeeze money, not just out of Argentina, but also Ecuador. I think other countries also like Zambia are in big trouble. There are other countries dependent on remittances like Lebanon that are under serious pressure. So if neither default nor the fact that you now have a freely floating exchange rate or currency is able to offer relief, I think that we basically will have a lot of the drawbacks that we had of the gold standard world, but none of the certainty. So that would be a kind of big risk.
Thank you. So we have some questions. We have at least two questions. I'm going to start with one that's been forwarded from David Schra, who says, solidarity isn't a concept that resonates with most Americans. Populist Americans seem to be responding with a concept of, quote, defending liberty. Can you comment, please? Isn't the New Deal analogy less dangerous and perhaps safer? Is there something toxic about the notion of solidarity in the US? Mm-hmm. I guess maybe that would be.
I mean, I think I've been quite struck by thinking of the New Deal. I've been really struck by the ability of not at the national level, but at the state level. Governor Cuomo's language in New York State seems to me to fit, admirably into the kind of New Deal canon, broadly speaking. It is solidaristic, in fact, without perhaps use. But I'm not actually. I wouldn't swear to the fact that he hasn't used the term solidarity. It has, broadly speaking, been social democratic politics of collective responsibility. He uses the word social and he uses the word society regularly. It's been very, and given America's, New York's particular tradition in the New Deal, I agree. I think that's a fairly straightforward continuity. And of course, the Green New Deal was invoking precisely that kind of language as well, in relation to another one of the challenges of the Anthropocene. That I actually was going to comment on Mark's remark about courts. I mean, we are already seeing Wisconsin just this morning struck down the lockdown order of its governor. Yes. The Supreme Court of Wisconsin, and we are seeing armed confrontations between, in Texas yesterday, I think, or the day before in Odessa, Texas, between militia on the one hand who are trying to force kind of squadristi style support for tattoo parlors and bars that want to reopen in the face of the armed, it's very peculiar because the governor is in favor of reopening. The city of Austin is against reopening. The SWAT style crews of policemen that show up, God knows where their sympathies lie, but they end up enforcing closures on heavily armed militia people and petty bourgeois shop, business. It's a totally bamboozling configuration that does occasionally, I have to say, evoke memories of the Biena Rosso in 1920s Italy. There's an odd frisson there when you see those confrontations.
Yes. Nick?
Well, I mean, my main thought on solidarity in the United States is that I agree that it's used much less often here, but I actually think that if you look at the kind of mechanisms for redistribution that were in crisis times adopted in the United States, and even far after the wars, the United States actually imposed a very substantial excess profit, windfall profits tax on its own oil industry in the 1980s after it decontrolled oil prices. I think that despite the fact that the term never really took off, historically speaking, the United States hasn't necessarily been less willing as a government to intervene. And as you were saying as well, they certainly also have no inherent distaste of debt. It's just the way that they talk about it versus what they do that really.
As Piketty will say, certainly by comparison with France, which uses the term solidarity a lot, and in fact the track record of redistributive taxation in France is far more ambiguous than that. You know, America had far more progressive tax rates than France did after World War I. You know, so there's no, absolutely. I mean, the redistribution happens in the US.
So we have another question from Margaret Crosby Arnold. Margaret, feel free to come online, as it were. And
okay, can you all see me?
Yes, we can.
Hi, how are you doing?
Hello, how are you all? Listen, thank you both for very, very interesting talks. I want to come back to something that Nick said, and just sort of add a little bit here. You said, you know, war economies magnify and bring out things that are already going on. And I think, you know, one of the issues here, I want to take this a little bit farther, just in terms of what I'm saying, is that it strikes me that what we have is a situation where it's a kind of a battle of the primacy of the economy versus human life, in many respects, certainly in the United States. And I would almost argue that in the context of the current administration, that the appeal to war is not necessarily that this is in reality a war in the traditional sense, but in fact expresses a desire for war for some of the reasons that I think Adam Tooze talked about, and also because this is simply a peculiar administration, I think, in US history. But I also think, just in terms of thinking about the impact of all of this and talking about this element of the primacy of the economy, is that primacy, that mentality of the primacy of the economy allows for overlooking of the human reality of this, which is there is simply a massive death toll. In some respects, it's not a war economy as much as it is simply something altogether new, a pandemic economy. And in talking about the war, talking about this as war, and thinking in terms of the primacy of the economy, that allows you to overlook something, which is frankly the massive amount of Black and Brown Latino deaths. And I think you have to stop and look at the fact that in the United States, the very opening, the idea of let's reopen the economy comes at a moment when statistics and data comes out and says, oh, well, some people get it, but if you happen to be a person of color, you're more likely to die from it. So that then gets back to this notion of labor, right? That Adam Tooze and you all have talked about. This notion of labor, is it vital or is it disposable and dispensable, right? And then in thinking in terms of historical models, the 20th century, of course, is important, in the 19th century, but I was thinking really more of the 18th century and the Napoleonic era, because you do also have this dynamic play out in the Napoleonic Wars, certainly in France, where there emerges this notion of economic security, right? They literally refer to it as economic security. And under the cover of economic security, that allows for reimposition of slavery. It also allows for genocide and a whole host of things that begin to take place under the auspices of this primacy of the economy, which is discussed as economic security. So, and I also think then if we think about the late 19th century as an era of kind of early modern globalization, if you will, that this is an era that's very similar to our own, because again, there's tremendous migration, there is increasing entanglement of the economies, but the type of migration is very different from the migration, I think, of the 19th century, because you have tremendous diversity in the migration that's taking place over the course of the 18th century, whether it's enslaved Africans or it is folks from India, so on. And there's a reaction against this actually in the UK and elsewhere. And part of what's going on then in the Napoleonic era, and as we emerge into the nation state, the notion of the nation state is in fact precisely a reaction against that migration and diversity that had emerged over the course of the late 18th century. So I'm wondering if that might not be a better model to think about what we're facing now.
Thank you.
I know that's a lot. My apologies.
No, thank you.
Mark, could I, if I might, I'd like to react on the issue of the economy.
Yeah.
Because this for me has been a kind of constant preoccupation since the beginning of the crisis. And I started very much in the position that you ended one of your remarks on by saying there's this extraordinary disparity between the scale of the economic damage and in fact, the loss of life, which judged by the standards of large previous pandemics is in fact modest. Clearly disproportionate in its impact on certain minorities, but modest in its overall impact. This is not HIV at all, and it's not 1918, 1919 pandemic influenza either. But then what has happened, and I would agree with Margaret that you see in the US now, so the first wave, in other words, was puzzling because it seemed like a sacrifice of the economy to the primacy of public health. And I think it genuinely was, and there is a deep rationality to that that's quite inescapable. But then what we've seen with growing impatience, and I've increasingly come to think of Trump as a sort of mirror of our own incoherence in thinking about this, rather than being able to distance myself from him. I feel that he often expresses things that I occasionally think in weak moments, but would never speak out loud, and there he does in public TV. What we've seen is a pressure to escape. And I would agree, Margaret, that there is, as it were, a primacy of the economic as a consolidated concept around which power is organized. This is a God which we must serve. I would agree about that. I also think that the economy hides specific interests, which wants to restart at the cost of other people. Yes. And never wanted to shut down in the first place and will barrel on. And that goes all the way from small shopkeepers coercing their staff back to work, to JP Morgan sending emails around to its young staffers at the height of the crisis in New York saying, this is an opportunity to trade, we need to be there, we need to see you in the office. So that is real. But there is also a third imperative, which I think we feel day by day more powerfully in the United States, which was expressed by Jerome Powell earlier this week, which is at the boundary of the relationship between the economy and society. Because the increasingly dominant reality of the United States right now is mass unemployment, which again is hugely damaging to the most vulnerable populations, to Black single mothers, to Hispanic families. We know that Hispanic women are the people who've suffered the most rapid increase in unemployment. We now have another 3 million people having attempted to sign on. There are states like Kentucky where a third of the workforce has attempted to apply for unemployment benefit in 2 months. Kentucky, a third of the workforce. These are biblical numbers, and it'll be worse. We haven't even digested the numbers that came out 8:30 this morning. There is a progressive case to be made for saying that given the extreme fragility of the structures of solidarity and welfare in the United States, we're, as it were, uncomfortably like India, where it's also not obvious, given the huge numbers of vulnerable people in the informal sector, that you can viably sustain a lockdown. This is not a welfare state like Germany or France. It isn't a well-organized power structure like China, where they can easily organize the delivery of food to tens or hundreds of thousands of people in lockdown. Won't happen here in the United States. We know that people will starve if that's what you do. You only have to look at Katrina in New Orleans to see how dramatic it could be. So there is a genuinely, a real dilemma of public policy that I think we confront with ever greater force as literally day by day in the United States. I mean, Jerome Powell yesterday in his press conference, which was supposed to be about macroeconomic policy, talk about the blurring of boundaries, highlighted the fact that of families in the US that subsist, and that is the right word, on less than $40,000 a year, because that puts you right down the bottom end of the income distribution. Of those families, 40% have lost one breadwinner, not to the disease through death, but through unemployment in March alone. So the most precarious households in the United States, which we know are overwhelmingly households in which where people of color are eking out and living, have suffered a cataclysmic loss in employment, and that's just March. We haven't even seen the April data yet. So there is a you know, a really dramatic pressure to recalibrate. So and that is of course the result of earlier failings, but at this point, you know, a country like the United States faces just two very bad options, extremely bad public health options, and absolutely devastating, not just economic but social consequences from this, from the lockdown.
Yeah, if I can just tag on to that, and again, you know, getting back to this, is I think that's what makes this different. That it's that at least in the wartime economy, certainly if we think about the Great Depression and then the shift towards World War II, there's a massive mobilization of people to actually fight war.
A huge migration of African American workers to Chicago and to California out of the South, right? It becomes a vehicle for liberation.
Exactly. So, but that does not exist in this particular context, which I think makes the crisis even deeper than the wartime crisis in some respects. And so that's what I mean when I say we're looking at a pandemic economy, which is the unknown versus a war economy.
Economic historians seriously argue about the question of whether consumption in the United States went down during World War II. It's not a settled fact that per capita consumption fell during World War II in the United States. We compare and contrast with the Soviet Union, and you can tell the difference. So totally on the same page. Yes, and specifically in its racial dynamics, much more threatening in some ways. I mean, the only hope is it won't last as long. But yeah.
So we have another question from Denise van der Leur, who asks, how do you think Western governments will react on their huge mountains of debt, and how should they respond?
I mean, I love what, I mean, Nick, you should elaborate on what you were saying earlier.
Yeah, I mean, this is very uneven, and I think that the problem in Europe, it has been plain to see now for a few weeks already that even issuing new debt is at the national level, it's accepted, but it's already being justified with the rhetoric that this retroactively justifies not issuing new debt in the last decade. So astonishingly, in countries like Germany and the Netherlands, the very proactive intervention now is being used as a way to justify the austerity of the last decade. And I think that that's something that's very dangerous, so that we need to break immediately. And maybe one thing to also to add on to the really interesting discussion just now about the pandemic economy and the specific vulnerable groups. I would say also that this new category that's taken off in the US, at least, I think it has been attracting more interest also in more mainstream media of deaths of despair in the last decade, right? Which was specifically focused on the people who effectively fell out of the labor force. But I would argue that there too, right, very vulnerable groups were at the center of it. And I think that this is an opportune moment to break the wall between the minorities now being most exposed to COVID and that group that was essentially a kind of overhang of the last crisis.
But I want to amplify what you said, Nick, about to focus on the debt issue. I mean, I loved you invoking Abba Lerner and functional finance. And I love the way in which you and Mark were pushing this in talking about, as it were, governments and power structures being forced into actions which they don't, as it were, have positive models for. So they end up living in a state of kind of cognitive dissonance, which is what I think the German Supreme Court ruling really brings home to us, is that then also creates huge vulnerabilities, because it's difficult to deny the basic truth of the German justices, which is that the ECB does a whole bunch of things which are not provided for in its statutes. And most of us strugglingly say, yes, c'est la vie, or, you know, wake up, smell the coffee, we're not in Kansas anymore. Like, didn't you hear? We're not in the 1950s. Like, those are our reactions. But of course, that's not an adequate legal reaction, because the justices say, well, no, hang on, like, get real about the law. That's not how the law works.
Right.
And so there is a real problem of adjustment that needs to happen in our thinking. And the neuralgic issue is debt. And the question is, I think, what are the politics of making the shift? And there was a proposal on the table last year in the United States from the Sanders campaign and the AOC group around the Green New Deal, which was modern monetary theory, MMT. And to a remarkable extent, this permeated the wonkish finance Twitter world of talk. And MMT proposes what amounts to a kind of cultural revolution about money. It's saying money isn't what you think it is. Money isn't something that's ultimately rooted in a fundamental value. Money isn't something that, as it were, reflects underlying values. It didn't originate in some silly story you tell yourselves about tribal bartering and then the efficiencies of money. It's a claim as radical in a way as the structuralist revolution in linguistics, or, you know, critiques of gender fundamentalism. It's saying, no, this structure is relational, it is created through law, it is a matter of politics and culture, it's therefore also ultimately a matter of power. And this is where Mark's question comes in. You know, so who has the power and who doesn't have the power, and what should the people who do have the power to essentially autonomously create their own money do with it? And then the question is, how far is that vision of freedom, in fact, bounded by the fact you're talking about the United States and not in some self-limiting structure like the EU, let alone in an externally limited structure like Argentina or one of the even weaker African borrowers. So that conversation is going on. And I think it's, you know, it's it's neuralgic. And I think the one interesting way of writing the history of the 20th century is the incomplete quality of that revolution, because that revolution in thinking about money goes back to the late 19th century at the very least. And it has repeatedly advanced along these functional pragmatic lines, insisting that, like law, this is human made, this is something we created. But then, as we see in law, there is always a countervailing tendency to say, no, back to foundations, back to the founders, back to natural rights. And we live in relation to the politics of money in a regime of oscillation like that. But we do now need urgently, and I'm with Mark and with Nick here entirely, for pragmatic and functional reasons, a reconceptualization. And the one moment where I heard, even in Nick's response, is like, it's not just that we need to get used to debt being okay as a short run response. We actually need to conceive of the possibility it's okay in the long run, like in the very long run. We actually have to get comfortable with the idea of perpetual debt, which is for most people, essentially contradictory idea. How could a debt be perpetual? And yet that's essentially what we need to own, is the possibility of this being a set of obligations that run with no finite limit. And this moment challenges us to address that. And I think of this as an anthropocenic challenge, because this is the easy bit. The money and law and institutions are the easy bit. As we're discovering with COVID-19, the really difficult bit is whether or not we can get an antibody test and a vaccine that will work. And as Anne Pettifor, one of the great campaigners on the Green New Deal, says, we need to get used to the idea that we can pay for anything we can do. The problem is doing the things we need to do. That's really difficult. The paying bit is stuff we can fix afterwards. That doesn't mean it's a trivial problem. That means it's quintessentially a problem of politics. It's quintessentially a problem of power, of discourse, of argument. None of those things are trivial, except they're a different order of problem from the, can we develop a vaccine? Or can we develop, hydrogen fuel systems that allow us to fly anymore? Those sorts of questions, which are the questions of the fundamental challenges of climate change.
We've got time probably for a last question, and in fact there are two questions that have come through, so I'm going to bundle them together, and then that will be the end of the questions. One is from Ralph Gochi, who basically asks, how can it possibly be, given rising unemployment and all the other indices of misery that we've described, that stock markets are going up? And the second is from Liam Hewitt, who says, and it's sort of connected, I think, or complementary, can we perhaps distinguish between actually being at war and taking on some helpful policies of the war economy model, such as perhaps excess profit taxes? It seems as though our political leaders don't leave us the choice whether or not we want to have a war economy. we already have many of its costs, hoarding, shortages, food crises, business concentration, profiteering, without its benefits. Could we not call out the lie of Trump and others who claim to be wartime presidents, but who refuse to expand the role of the state as it would need to manage a war economy to meet the challenges of the shutdown? So one is about stock markets, and the other is about, shouldn't we in fact have a real wartime state?
Well, I'm happy to respond to the last one, because that was essentially one of the stakes of I think making the analogy also. Yes, people and leaders of government will say that they're in a war economy, but they actually have a very limited sense of what actually went on. And there are a lot of very interesting and important things that they would rather not talk about. So in a sense, this is of course a risky move, but in a sense you could argue in certain areas the bluff has to be called, and then you say, yes, we are in a war economy. How about we do those and those and those and those things that we did in the war? Because that actually exposes it for the kind of farcical, opportunistic invocation it often is. So excess profit taxation would be a very good one. The other one, and that kind of goes back to the previous question and discussion we had about debt, in the United States, that's very interesting, is the power of statutory renegotiation. It's not often talked about. It's a fairly obscure kind of legal power, but essentially, if expropriation is about undermining property rights, then statutory renegotiation is about being able to renegotiate contracts. And in the United States, that has a particular force because, as we all know, the certain industries, especially the military industrial complex, but also the pharmaceutical industry, are able to accumulate enormous profits by essentially offering as monopoly suppliers certain important goods, whether it's arms technology or very expensive medicine that really ought to be much cheaper, and then essentially accumulate profits that way. And statutory renegotiation would be a way of saying, in the social interest, it is possible for the government after the fact to say that a certain contract paid too much to a supplier, and we will after the fact you recalculate what does it actually reasonably cost, and you say that was excess profit and you take it away. That's a fundamental way of actually kind of really undercutting the sanctity of contracts, but it's one that we will have to think about if we are going to adopt that flexibility and that pragmatism. Yeah.
I'll take on the this question about the stock market, and I do think I would approach it in the way that Nick suggested in his opening remarks, which is to try and read off it. I mean, one interpretation of the stock market right now is it's a crazy bubble and it's about to burst, and so don't count on it staying there, and next week we could be in a very different world. Not all stock markets are up. The one that is up is the United States one. That could simply be pro-Trump people who have drunk the Kool-Aid are a disproportionate share of the people who move the market. You only have to see how Wall Street reacted the day after Trump was elected. It was vertiginous. So there is, as it were, a bubble element to this. But I think more seriously, we should read it in the way that Nick was suggesting in his comments, which is reflective of the profound inequalities that this crisis exposes and compounds. Because if you actually look inside the global stock markets, and particularly inside the US one right now, it isn't all stock which are doing well. In fact, the growth is almost entirely concentrated in the leading companies in the NASDAQ index, which are the tech companies. And so in what, and amongst investors, this is complete, common knowledge. And what it reflects is a gamble essentially on the power of those organizations, both technologically to dominate markets, but also presumably to manipulate the political system to their advantage, to ensure that those profits are not regulated out of existence. And so the collapse of the Sanders campaign in the middle of this crisis was very good news for those kind of entities, as it was for the healthcare sector. There's investors like Warren Buffett are completely explicit about their logic. He says, I'll put money into entities that have moats. He doesn't actually use the word robber baron, but he invokes what robber barons lived in, which is castles with moats. I mean, that is the basic logic of investment. Find the people who have either through technological advantage or through incumbency or vast access to capital or control of the political system, the opportunity of generating monopolistic or oligopolistic profit. And that's what the index tells you. So tech is a safe haven now, believe it or not. It's not, you don't buy it as a cutting edge investment, you buy it because it's the bit that whilst everything else drowns, will swim. And this is not simply a matter of capital. If you look at the analyses of income inequality in the United States, a very large component of the income inequality in the United States is generated not just between the life chances of different groups in American society, but of the huge difference in compensation between people who are on the privileged side of this structure and people who are on the outside of this structure. And this cuts to the heart of where we are ourselves and where we stand. If you are privileged, as I am and Mark is, to be tenured at an institution like Columbia, you don't basically have any worries right now. If you are on the outside of that structure in the academic labor market and you are precarious, your salary is a fraction of the sort of salaries that we are able to command, and your life chances and your professional chances are incredibly fragile, both within the educational system. And we know what has happened to the cost of education in the United States as universities like ours have exploited their monopoly credentialing position. So there is those stock market prices reflect a highly realistic gamble by privileged people on their ability to sustain their privilege. And it's as, you know, as stark as you could possibly ask for. I mean, throughout this crisis so far, you know, the Thursday morning unemployment insurance release comes out 8:30 a.m. Thursday morning. And on the majority of days, it's been a good day for Wall Street, as the record will show this to have been the worst 2 months in the entire history of the American economy. It's a shocking and glaring, I mean, almost unbelievably transparent transcription of power and economic privilege.
So I think that our time is drawing to a close. One of the few privileges I don't have is to stop the clock. Otherwise, I would happily listen to this conversation for much, much longer. I'd like to just remind everybody that next week, we are going to have the privilege of hearing Amy Hungerford, the new EVP for Arts and Sciences at Columbia, talking about her work, which is on reading sociable solitude, the sociability of solitude. But I would actually just like to end today by thanking Nicholas Mulder and Adam Tooze. Thank you both. So it's very nice, firstly, to see you both again. And also very, very nice to hear you and have had the chance to hear your thoughts on this. So thank you from the Institute for being with us today.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
Very nice.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.